faster my Ellen Bannon. In other words, thank you very much. Good evening from the Isle of Man. I am sitting in a very windy and stormy Isle of Man. If you can hear the crash of waves in the distance, in the background, it's because my house is literally 1 minute from the promenade, and we've had an absolute pounding today. So yes, okay, to business perhaps. Let me just get rid of this on the screen because it's annoying me. Thank you. Right, good. Okay, the Battle of Waterloo. Well, let me begin by sweetening the pill. I can actually offer you some freebies, which you can download for yourselves. The first is an e-guide to the battlefield. It's basically an electronic version of a book I published a few years ago called Walking Waterloo, which is essentially a series of walking tours of the battlefield. The electronic version has some disadvantages in respect to the book and vice versa. Nothing is ever perfect. But if you were to type in Waterloo education into the app stores on your mobile phone, it will work either with Apple or with Samsung or whatever. If you type in Waterloo education, or alternatively University of Liverpool Waterloo education always seems to get there, you should end up with a little icon of a picture of Waterloo. If you download that, it's absolutely free, because it was done as basically experimental work by the university computer department. That's absolutely free, and it'll give you a series of walks around the battlefield on the basis of Google Earth maps. I won't explain how to use it now, because it would take up a bit of time. If anybody has any difficulties navigating their way around it, we tried to make it as intuitive as possible. If anybody has any difficulties, please do feel free to email me, and I will do my best to point you in the right direction. It has, I should say, been thoroughly road tested. I have tramped every inch of that battlefield many times over and worn out a great deal of shoe leather. The other thing is actually my latest book, which you can get for free as a download. It's actually called Wargaming Waterloo, and it looks at the way in which the Battle of Waterloo has been tackled over the past 50 years or so by the historical simulations industry. You can buy lots and lots of board war games of Waterloo. And what I did was I worked through a lot of them and examined the way in which Waterloo had been represented, in just the same way as you might look at the way in which Waterloo had been painted, for example. Obviously, lots of paintings of Waterloo. Board war games is, they're a cultural artifact. But anyhow, and I use them to literally war game a number of alternative scenarios, and to look at the way in which things might have worked out or might not have worked out. And there you'll get, at the beginning, a detailed, well, at least my version of the history of the battle, which is absent from the app. Anyway, it's called Walking Waterloo, and you can get it for free from the United States Marine Corps University Press. Modern armies use wargaming all the time, and the US Marine Corps was genuinely very interested in what I was doing. Immediately after the Russians invaded Ukraine, back in February last year, the US Army actually ran a war game of the campaign, and they came up with pretty much the results that we saw last year, with the Russians being beaten back from Kiev and so forth. So anyway, there you go, a couple of freebies. It might help too if you were to just download a map of the Battle of Waterloo. So you've got it on your screen in front of you. There are loads and loads and loads of them. And you know, just download them for nothing. That might help. Okay, now let's begin with something which I hope that many of you will have seen. Let's begin with the film Waterloo, which I remember being taken to see as a very excited 10-year-old in the summer of 1970 by my father. The film Waterloo presents a certain, if you like, version of Waterloo, a certain story of Waterloo. And it's essentially the one with which most people are familiar if they're with the story at all. The film begins with Napoleon abdicating at Fontainebleau in 1814. And it doesn't show anything about Elba, but you know, the next bit is he comes back from Elba in March 1815. He arrives in France. People of France throw themselves at his feet. He gets to Paris. He's carried on the shoulders of the people up into the Tuileries. And then, of course, he marches off to war, and you get the Battle of Waterloo. And the version of the Battle of Waterloo that follows is one that in many ways follows a sort of a fairly standard narrative, if you want. The battle begins with the Anglo-Dutch army and the French army facing each other across a narrow valley. And the French attack the Chateau of Hougoumont, which is on basically the right of the British line, if you like. And then there's a long artillery bombardment and a massive French infantry advance. And they're chased off by British cavalry, the famous charge of the Scots Greys. And you have this slow motion cavalry charge in which no infantry appear whatsoever. It's all very strange. The reason no infantry appear in it is that all the Russian extras kept running away and they wouldn't stand and fight. So they eventually had to film it without any infantry at all, which is why it looks so strange. Anyway, and we switch to Napoleon's headquarters, and somebody says, "What's that shadow on the hills over there?" And he looks through his telescope, and they can't decide if it's French blue or Prussian black. The Prussians wore blue too, but don't worry about that. This is Hollywood. Anyway, and I can't quite remember actually whether he does decide that they're Prussians, but certainly according to the traditional version, round about lunchtime, he realizes that the Prussians are on their way. So we move on a little bit, and you have Marshal Ney riding to glory at the head of all the French cavalry, and they attack the Anglo-Dutch squares on the ridge and are driven off. And then finally, you get the attack of the infantry of the Imperial Guard, or at least the infantry of the Old and Middle Guard, and they're driven off by some heroic British infantry doing completely ahistorical things, which would have got their own heads blown off if they tried it on a battlefield. But never mind, as I say, this is Hollywood. And the French fall back, and then you have this scene of the last stand of the Old Guard. And that's basically the story which is projected by the film, and it's a story which follows a fairly traditional narrative, a very pro-Napoleonic narrative, but fairly traditional narrative. Now, let's move on a little bit. Let's imagine for a second what would have happened had the French won the Battle of Waterloo. Well, classically, it's always said, well, we'd have all ended up speaking French. No, even if Napoleon had won, that wasn't how the French Empire worked. But there's certainly an assumption there that had the French won the battle, things would have been very different. And certainly people who are fans of Napoleon, adore Napoleon, they dream of this great victory in which would have led to the Ancien regime being swept away, revolutions breaking out across Europe, and everybody living happily ever after. That's not Hollywood. Nobody's made a film like that. I haven't seen the Ridley Scott film yet. I suppose he might say something about that. I've no idea. So I can't say it's Hollywood, but it's still rubbish. What I'm going to do this evening is essentially to do two things. First of all, to talk you through the battle, to show you that the accepted narrative of the battle makes no sense whatsoever. And in many ways, it's a put-up job, particularly the French side of things, designed to make Napoleon look better. There is a British side of things as well, which is designed to make Wellington look better. And then I'm going to move on to what would actually have happened as far as we can work out. Of course, it's counterfactual history. We can't be certain. But there are a whole series of factors which we do know for certain. And we can, if you like, apply to the situation. So first of all, if you like, the tactical events of the battle, and then the strategic effects of a Napoleonic victory, and indeed what was going on in France at the time, which is something that we don't hear about very often. Back in 2016 or so, I actually published a book called Napoleon, France and Waterloo, The Eagle Rejected, which took a completely heretical line, and there were howls of protest from the Napoleon fan club, and believe you me, there is a Napoleon fan club. And how dare I say that the French people didn't rally to Napoleon when he came back? I think that's the position that we might start from. What happens when Napoleon comes back to France? Yes, in the film, we see excited crowds cheering him. We see French soldiers throwing down their arms rather than fire at him. We see him being carried into the Tuileries. The vast majority of French people, insofar as we know, were absolutely horrified that the wretched man had reappeared. By 1814, they were absolutely exhausted. France was exhausted. Nobody wanted to fight this endless series of wars which got nowhere, however many victories the French won. The economy was in ruins. There was massive resistance to conscription. People had had enough, and they were just delighted when Napoleon was overthrown. When Napoleon comes back, there is widespread horror. And indeed, there are serious insurrections in parts of France, particularly in the west, in the Vendée. The Vendée had always been a source of trouble for the revolution. And in 1815, it rises in revolt. And at the time of Waterloo, 20,000 desperately needed French troops were fighting in the west of France. Nowhere near Waterloo. Now, you'll read in some books that Napoleon comes back and he immediately raises an army of 600,000 men. No, he doesn't. Had he been able to mobilize the whole of the National Guard, and had all the men who had been soldiers, who had been demobilized in 1814 and were living civilian lives, had they all come back, he might have got 600,000 men. But the National Guard wouldn't fight. very few of them turn up for duty. This was kind of the militia, and only about half the men who had been turned off in 1814, when Napoleon abdicates and the Bourbons come back, only about half of them came back. So he never had more than about 250,000 men. And the vast majority of those were troops who were already serving when he sailed back from Elba. Now, in the army, there was support for Napoleon. But in society as a whole,
apologies, Charles. I think you've gone to mute. I'm not quite sure how. There you are. You're back.
How much of that did people miss? Where did I?
Only just a fraction of a second.
Okay, right. Okay, jolly good. Sorry about that. Okay, where was I? Yes, in the army there was support for Napoleon, but not in the rest of French society. Not amongst the common people, who had got very little out of the Napoleonic Empire, and not amongst, if you like, the propertied classes, who were scared stiff that they were going to lose everything because Napoleon was leading them to hell and back, or rather just to hell. So very interestingly, one thing that Napoleon doesn't do is that he doesn't reimpose conscription. Too scared. It's as simple as that. And that means that this 250,000 men, some of whom had to be used to guard the frontiers against the Austrians, and behind them the Russians, some of them had to be used to guard the Pyrenees against the Spaniards, some of them had to be used to fight internal dissent. So this 250,000 men or so, not all of which can be used against the most obvious military target, and I'll come on to that in a minute, is all he's got. It's all he's got, and there's no way of actually replenishing it if things go wrong. So, behind him, France is in uproar and completely unimpressed with the decrees called the decrees of the liberal empire. And Napoleon instigates a more parliamentary style regime, but nobody believed it. So he goes off to war, and he decides that the best thing he can do in this situation, a situation in which the whole of Europe has declared him an outlaw, the best thing to do is to strike hard, strike fast, and go for the nearest Allied forces. And they happened to be the British, or rather Anglo-Dutch. The official title is the Army of the Netherlands. It was only about 1/3 British, 1/3 minor German states, and 1/3 Dutch-Belgian. And that was the Army of Wellington. And you also had the Prussian Army of the Lower Rhine, commanded by Marshal Blücher. And basically, the former were in the western half of what is today Belgium, and the latter were in the eastern half of what is today Belgium. And Napoleon's idea was to strike hard, strike fast, strike in between them, drive them apart, and then turn on one, and then turn on the other. It's called the strategy of the central position, and it's a classic Napoleonic move. Now, I won't bore you with the details of the campaign. It will go on too long. But basically, things don't work out as Napoleon planned. On his left flank, he's held to a draw by the forces of the Duke of Wellington at a place called Quatre Bras. And on his right flank, he does defeat the Prussians at a place called Ligny and forces them to retreat. But he doesn't know where they're going, and he tries to guess where they're going, and he gets it completely wrong. He thinks that they're going to head east towards the Rhine, towards Germany, towards safety. And he sends about a third of his army off in pursuit under a chap called Marshal Grouchy, who's actually spelt Marshal Grouchy, which and I'm sure he was grouchy given the hand he was dealt by Napoleon. Actually, the Prussian army retreats northwards towards Brussels, and the Anglo-Dutch army fell back parallel with it. So you end up with a situation in which you've got Wellington's army drawn up on a ridge called Mont Saint-Jean, which Wellington had chosen as already chosen as if you like his last ditch fighting position before he had to give up Brussels. It's only about 12 miles south of Brussels. And the Prussian army of Blücher, about 10 miles away to the east at a place called Wavre. And Wellington and Blücher got on very well together. They had discussed everything that they could discuss. The idea was that they would always try and keep their armies in touch with one another. And if things got to this point, if one was attacked without the other being attacked, well, the other one would march over and join the party. And that's why Wellington stood and fought at Waterloo, because he knew, or he was as sure as he could be of anything, that the Prussians would be on their way. And they're only 10 miles away, and so he could probably expect them by about midday or thereabouts. Meanwhile, Grouchy, just in case you're wondering about him, he is miles and miles and miles off to the east, having been sent in completely the wrong direction. He eventually turns north, and he does discover that there are some Prussian troops at Wavre that he never realizes it's the whole Prussian army. And frankly, Napoleon has got no idea that there is this enormous Prussian army which is poised to strike his flank. And incidentally, the forces commanded by Grouchy were far too small to stop the Prussians, even if they had got in contact, actually. But that's a side issue. Okay, let's go to Waterloo, to the battle between Wellington and Napoleon, which is portrayed in the movie Waterloo. Well, let's start off with the battlefield. That's the first thing that has to be reassessed. To me, a battlefield is a document, just the same as any other document. It is something that can be read. And believe me, I spent a long, long time reading it and wearing out lots and lots of shoe leather in the process. Incidentally, I do hope that some of you, as a result of this, might be inspired to visit Waterloo. Brussels is a lovely city, and Waterloo itself is a fascinating battlefield if you get away from the tourist traps. If all you do is go to the Lion Mound and go up the top of it and look at it from the top, then you're not going to understand anything. You need to get out and walk around. And it's a wonderful battlefield to walk around. You can find so much and understand so much more. Okay, the standard version is two ridges parallel to each other. British on one, Anglo-Dutch on one, and the French on the other, shallow valley in between. So when you get to the battlefield, you find that it's not like that at all. The dominant feature of the battlefield is not an east-west ridge, as you might expect, the ridge that the Anglo-Dutch are sitting on. It's not at all. It's actually a north-south ridge, which runs just west of the Brussels-Charleroi Highway, which splits the battlefield in two, and it connects the two positions. You can actually walk all the way from La Belle Alliance, which was basically Napoleon's command post on the front line, all the way across to where the Lion Mound is, this enormous mound which the Dutch put up in about 1825, on the level. You don't have to go either down or up. It's like a land bridge. It's actually a watershed between two river systems. Now, on either side, yes, you've got the ridges, if you want. But believe me, it's a much more complicated battlefield than you might think. Now, the next thing to talk about, the various British held or German held outposts. You've got Hougoumont, which was in front of Wellington's right flank. You've got Les Saintes, which was a smaller farm which stood in front of Wellington's centre, just by the high road. And then over on the Anglo-Dutch left flank, you've got a place called Papelotte, which is another fairly typical walled Belgian farm. Hougoumont is a much more substantial complex. It was there was a chateau, a small chateau, surrounded by quite a large farm. Now, Wellington always made a great deal of the defence of Hougoumont. He was once asked who were the bravest men at the Battle of Waterloo, and he comes up with a lieutenant colonel and a sergeant of the guards, famously closed the gates at Hougoumont. And if you go to Hougoumont today, you can see a monument depicting that very moment at that very spot. Thing was that Wellington was a very, very aristocratic general, and he had a predilection for the guards. And he was going to incline to say that the bravest men at Waterloo were chaps in the guards. And British accounts of Waterloo always make a huge amount of the defence of Hougoumont, and there was very, very fierce fighting around the place, much as is depicted in the film. The film also makes a huge amount of the defence of Hougoumont. And it becomes, if you like, a classic battle within a battle. This has to be deconstructed. In the first place, if you go to Hougoumont, you quickly realise it is completely hopeless as a defensive position. It sits in a hollow. It doesn't command anything. And it's virtually surrounded, or was virtually surrounded. Unfortunately, it is all gone now, so it doesn't look the same. It's virtually surrounded by thick woods and orchards. If you're going to use it as a fire base, you have to hold the perimeter. You have to hold the edge of these woods and orchards. And as soon as the French moved against it, the fact there were German soldiers who were holding it from a principality called Nassau, they're driven back to the chateau itself. And the chateau is held, the adjacent garden is held, but the defenders are completely blind. They can't fire out. They can't fire any further than into the woods and so forth around them. And it's a completely useless position. Why does it have to be talked up? Because Wellington got it wrong. If you look at Wellington's array, if you look at the way in which he deployed his forces, if you've got a map in front of you, you will see that Wellington puts 2/3 of his forces on his right centre and indeed his right. So if you like, if you're heading towards Brussels, coming from the French point of view, it's off to the left. And it's not just a question of lining the ridge to Hougoumont. He also angles his line back. There's huge numbers of troops stretching back northwards to a place called Braine-l'Alleud. Why did he do this? Because For reasons I have never quite understood, Wellington was obsessed with the idea that Napoleon intended to turn his right flank, to get between him and the English Channel. But he got it completely wrong. The French didn't attack there. Napoleon's plan was actually to hook round Wellington's left, which had been left quite unprotected. Only about a third of the army there, and some of them not very good troops. Wellington famously said that his army at Waterloo was an infamous army. Even many of the British regiments were basically made up of completely raw troops. And the same was the case with the Dutch and the Germans who were fighting with him. It wasn't a very good army. And the reason why Napoleon plumps to go for Wellington's left is quite simple. You go back to the terrain. It's completely open. The thing about Hougoumont was that it was useless as a defensive position, but the French couldn't move through it. They might be able to capture it, but as soon as you come out the other side, you've got the ridge going up in front of you, and it's actually quite steep there. You wouldn't have been able to move through the complex as formed troops. You'd have to filter them through, which means you'd have had to stop and form all up on the other side, literally under the guns of Wellington's army, and within easy range of cavalry who'd come charging over the top and wipe you out. You couldn't attack through Hougoumont. You had to go the other way. And Wellington gets it completely wrong. And this is one of the reasons why Hougoumont gets talked up so much in the British accounts. Now, it's not quite true to say that the French didn't attack it. Napoleon's plan was essentially that the troops on his left wing, the Second Corps, commanded by General Reille, composed of 3 divisions and a brigade of cavalry. One of the divisions is commanded by Jérôme Bonaparte, who's Napoleon's younger brother. They were to move forward and contain Wellington's right, centre, and right. And they move into the woods at Hougoumont, marching downhill through the woods, and they bump straight into this chateau, which they didn't really know was there because you can't see it from the French lines. And Jérôme, who happened to be commander of the leading division, was a very brash young man, and he decides to try and take this chateau. Now, he didn't have to do that at all. Napoleon's orders were simply that you contain Wellington's right. But Jérôme goes in all out. And in a sense, although he's often criticised for that, it was actually a pretty good thing to do. Because Wellington becomes more and more convinced that this is where the real French attack is. And he sends more troops down, including some veteran British guards, down to defend this chateau. Complete waste of manpower. It could have been abandoned without the slightest effect on the British line. It's a useless position. But this long battle breaks out, if you like, a battle within a battle. But the real fighting, the real decision, if you like, is going to come on the other side of the road. And Napoleon's other infantry corps, which he's got on the field, First Corps, his biggest corps, under a general called Drouet, it marches off across the valley to attack the defending line in front of it. Bypasses Les Saintes. Now, Les Saintes gets talked about as a very useful flanking position, and troops holding it could pour fire into anybody who marches past it. Well, go and have a look at Les Saintes. Count the number of windows. The troops in it hadn't been able to make any loopholes or anything like that because all their tools had been sent down to Hougoumont to go and fortify that. So defending the place was very difficult. They could put troops outside, but of course, if you put troops outside, they could be driven back in again. So actually, the amount of fire it could deliver in any given direction was limited, extremely limited. And the French basically ignore it. They march past it, up the ridge, and perish the thought. You don't usually get this in the British accounts. They actually break the infantry on the ridge facing them, including some British troops who are driven back in disorder. And then we come to the man who really wins the Battle of Waterloo, who's the Duke of Uxbridge, who's Wellington's cavalry commander. And acting completely off his own bat, he sees what's going on. He's got 2 brigades of heavy cavalry, including the famous Scots Greys, and he launches them in this devastating charge, which catches the French just at the wrong moment. Very, very vulnerable moment. When troops have actually taken their objectives, they think they've got the enemy on the run. They're going to be in some disorder. They're going to be blown. They'll be marching uphill, and it's really, really muddy, like really muddy. You know, believe me, it still is. You try walking across Waterloo after it's been raining for a couple of days, and you will end up with clods of earth, of thick clay on your boots like you've never seen. It's like wading through wet concrete. So hit them at just the moment they think they've won, and they'll get swept away. And indeed, they do get swept away, driven back. And the Scots Greys and the other British cavalry go charging across the valley, capture lots of prisoners, but they go out of control. The French cavalry countercharge, and this is shown in the film. The commander of the Union Brigade, which is the brigade the Scots Greys are in, a chap called Ponsonby, is caught by French lancers and is skewered to death, basically. Meanwhile, according to the traditional account, some time since, Napoleon, has been peering out to the east, and he's saying, "Oh, who are these chaps in the distance?" And he decides they're the Prussians. No, he doesn't. That is a complete and total fabrication. And the reason why we know it's a complete and total fabrication is if you stand at La Belle Alliance and you look out to the right, to the east, to the direction in which the Prussians were coming, you see an enormous ridge running north-south about a mile away. And you cannot see beyond it. And there is no way that even Napoleon could see through a hill as solid as that. Napoleon, in short, had no idea that the Prussians were coming. There are stories that some French cavalry went out and they encountered the Prussians and they take a prisoner and they bring him back to Napoleon. No, they didn't. That story comes from the memoirs of Marbot, and Marbot was one of the biggest liars in the French army. I mean, if you read his memoirs and if you take them apart, I mean, porkies is not the word. Grande charcuterie might be. Anyway, so Napoleon doesn't know that the Prussians are coming. He thinks he's got all the time in the world. And so he starts reforming. His troops are being thrown back, and they're going to make a new assault. At the same time, on his extreme right wing, there arrives his 3rd Infantry Corps, the 6th Corps of General Mouton. Now, that corps is always shown sitting neatly in the middle of Napoleon's line as a reserve at the start of the battle. That's what it shows on the traditional maps. It wasn't there. French staff work was appalling. The march to Waterloo had gone very badly. And actually, Sixth Corps starts the battle miles off the field, well to Napoleon's right rear. But it's coming up. Napoleon knows this, and he's going to use it, if you like. If you can imagine a club, and it's swinging down on the opponent from the right, the handle of the club is the rather battered remnants of First Corps, but the nice solid blob on the end of the club is Sixth Corps, which was fresh. And this was going to sweep down on Napoleon's, on Wellington's left, drive it away. Everything's under control, except it isn't, because Napoleon has already seen that Wellington and his subordinates are quite capable of launching sudden counterattacks, and he's not really in a position to be able to hold one. And this is where the cavalry comes in. According to the traditional version of events, Ney goes berserk and thunders off at the head of all of Napoleon's cavalry to go and attack Wellington's infantry, who are all formed in a square and are therefore totally invulnerable. According to some versions, he thinks he sees the Anglo-Dutch withdrawing. According to others, he simply goes nuts and takes it into his head to go riding off at the head of the whole cavalry. Again, this story is demonstrable nonsense. It comes from Napoleon and his supporters trying to put the blame on everybody else. In reality, the charge was ordered by the emperor himself. And what he was trying to do was not to break Wellington's army at all. It was rather to pin it in place until this new assault could go in on against Wellington's left. And it's just about to do so, about 4:30 in the afternoon now, it's just about to do so when, hey presto, completely out of nowhere, the Prussians arrive. And they burst out. It still can't be seen from Napoleon's headquarters. They're just the other side of this enormous ridge I told you about. And they come bursting out of this wood called the Bois de Paris, literally 200 or 300 yards away from the waiting men of Sixth Corps, were taken completely by surprise. And if you're looking for French heroes at Waterloo, don't go to the Imperial Guard. I'll come back to them in a bit. You need to think about the unsung heroes, just ordinary squaddies of Mouton's Corps. Taken completely by surprise, they managed to form up in a defensive line just on the crest of the ridge I was talking about, and they hold up the Prussians for quite a while. And more Prussians were arriving, coming out of the woods, and they're starting to flow around the flanks of this French defensive line. And Mouton's Corps is forced back to Plancenoit, which is this village behind Napoleon's right wing. And they get embroiled in a ferocious battle there, where they're joined by part of the Imperial Guard, the junior formation known as the Young Guard. Now, we get to about 6 o'clock in the evening, and Napoleon has still got the whole of the old guard and the middle guard, the most veteran troops of his guard, waiting to go into action. They're still in reserve. And just at this point, Ney manages to take Les Saintes. The garrison runs out of ammunition and they're overwhelmed. Farmhouse is taken. Doesn't matter in itself very much. If you go to Les Saintes, there's no way you can fire at anybody in Wellington's main line. They're over the top of the ridge, and you're completely overlooked. But there's no doubt that Wellington's centre was in a mess. And Ney sends a message back to Napoleon, and he says, Sire, I've taken Reconsidered, send me some troops. And Napoleon, a massive error, says, troops, do you expect to make troops? I won't send him any. Eventually, an hour or so later, a little bit more, he does send in the bulk of the old and middle guard to attack Wellington's centre. But the attack is delivered incredibly badly. The only chance the French had was, again, to strike hard and strike fast, strike in one mass and hit the defending line really hard and break through. It doesn't happen. The attack, because of the configuration of the ground, they're basically attacking up this ridge, which I said linked the two positions together. And for technical reasons I won't go into, the effect of that is that the formations drift apart. And so they hit the defending line in 3 different places, not at the same time. And they're driven off. And they flee in retreat. Now, according to the traditional story again, the French army see the guard running away, and they all shout, "Ah, la garde recule, sauf qui peut," and run away. No, they don't. They might have done on the western half of the battlefield, but because of this ridge across the battlefield, north-south, anybody who was on the eastern side of the Brussels High Road could not see what was happening. They don't run away because of the guard. They run away because a fresh corps of Prussian troops suddenly appears and hit the French defensive line just near Papelot. And that really puts the kibosh on things, and the whole French army falls apart. Except, according to tradition, for the famous last stand of the Imperial Guard, which is of course portrayed in glorious technicolor in Bondarchuk's film Waterloo. The last stand of the Imperial Guard is the most famous action in military history that never happened. There were 3 battalions of the Guard who had not been sent forward in the attack. All the others are just running away as fast as they can. And an attempt is made to, if you like, mount a rearguard action. But it doesn't go on very long. The units concerned simply withdraw from the field after a short fight. And we know their casualty figures. It's simply not true that they were wiped out. They certainly didn't die to the last man or anything like it. So much for Waterloo. We see a battle which really did not happen in the way in which it was supposed to have happened. But let us say, just for a second, that Napoleon had somehow won. Now, clearly, the key moment is the fall of Les Saintes. Let us say he sent forward troops at that moment. It is probable he would have gained what is called a tactical victory. Had Wellington and his army been broken and forced from the field, it's probable that Blücher, who could see what was going on from his position up on the high ridge to the west, it's probable that he would have fallen back. It's probable that Napoleon would have then marched on to Brussels, taken Brussels. But his cavalry, because of these cavalry charges, which he himself had launched, his cavalry were exhausted, suffered terrible casualties, no position to pursue anybody. So Wellington's army would have got away and it would have retreated. And for some, there's this bizarre idea that Wellington would always have retreated on Ostend. No, he wouldn't. Why on earth would you do that? The obvious place to go is Antwerp, and that's where Wellington was planning to go. Antwerp is due north, it's not very far away, and it is a massive fortress. The Anglo-Dutch army would have withdrawn inside, Napoleon would have marched up to the walls, and he wouldn't have been able to do a thing because he didn't have a siege train with him. Presumably, he would have had to leave behind a substantial number of men, 30,000 men perhaps, to keep the Allies, keep Wellington. Wellington and his men penned up inside the walls. But he wouldn't have had enough men to take on the Prussians, let alone the Austrians and Russians who were busily arriving on the eastern French frontiers. I think it is absolutely certain that militarily, all that would have happened would have been there would have been a series of battles, possibly one decisive battle, in which the French forces, and remember I said they had no reserves, there was no way you could conscript French troops, Napoleon hadn't dared do that. They had certainly been ground down and eventually overwhelmed. And probably in such an event, the decisive battle would have been somewhere in Lorraine or Burgundy or somewhere like that, further to the southeast, kind of north of Switzerland, if you see what I mean. And so one can dream about the final battle actually taking place at a place called Nancy. So we could talk about not Napoleon meeting his Waterloo, but Napoleon meeting his Nancy, which I think is rather neat. But just to wrap up, there are people who believe that the rest of Europe would have, had Napoleon won at Waterloo, that in the rest of Europe, either that the governments would all have made peace, or that the peoples of Europe would have risen up and say, wonderful, we want the French back. Why? Why on earth would anybody believe such nonsense? There was an obsession amongst British soldiers that the Belgians couldn't be trusted, because until 1814 they'd been part of France and they'd all fought in the French army. And it's true, most of the Dutch and Belgian generals who fight at Waterloo have actually fought for the French. Many of the troops had fought for the French. Did anybody like fighting for the French? Did anybody like being part of the French Empire? No, they didn't. It wasn't nice. Equally, the peoples of Germany were thoroughly sick of Napoleonic occupation, thoroughly sick of the way in which they'd been treated, and there was no way that they were going to rise in revolt in support of the French. In fact, the one place where something like this happens is actually down in the south of Italy. Marshal Murat had been king of Naples and remained king of Naples after 1814, and he attempts. He's the one person who comes out in support of Napoleon, and just prior to Waterloo, he actually attacks or marches north to attack the Austrians, and he dreams of this great Italian insurrection. Needless to say, this Italian insurrection simply doesn't happen. Never was going to happen. The Italians had had enough of the French as well. So the idea of revolution breaking out across Europe is nonsense. What about the Allied governments? What about the Prussian government, the Russian government, the Austrian government? Are they going to crack up just because Napoleon's won a battle at Waterloo? No, they're not. No way. They too had had quite enough of Napoleon, thank you very much. He'd been declared an international outlaw when he comes back from Elba. But long before that, they'd come to the conclusion, all the powers of Europe had come to the conclusion that Napoleon simply wasn't somebody you could have around. Napoleon wasn't somebody who could be fitted into the international order. The international order, I mean, yes, all of these powers are imperial states in one way or another, but they all understood that there was a game which you played and you stuck to the rules. You respected the other guys. You didn't push them too far. Yes, you could try and steal a march here, steal a march there, but you didn't push them too far. You didn't, for the sake of argument, if you were the Emperor of Austria, you didn't overthrow the King of Prussia. You didn't attempt to take over the whole of Prussia. There were all sorts of checks and limitations that held them in place. And Napoleon simply would not respect them. You could not do a deal with him. You could not make peace with him. He had proved that over and over again. He had to be got rid of. And this was their opportunity to do so. And they weren't going to let it go. So to come back to, if you like, the strategic significance of Waterloo, the fact is, in a sense, and yes, it's a provocative thing to say, it's a glorious irrelevance. It really didn't matter about the French winning. They'd just have been defeated somewhere else, further down the line. Wellington wouldn't have got the glory, perhaps, but they'd still have been defeated. There's no way, I think, that the French can sensibly be made to win. And in fact, I mean, I actually wargame the whole campaign of 1814 in one of the chapters of my book, Wargaming Waterloo. And basically that is what happens. You can't win if you're the French. And lastly, to go back to poor old Marshal Grouchy, who's been sent off in completely the wrong direction by Napoleon, and who gets all the blame for not turning up. Physically, he could not have made it to the battle in time to intervene. He's simply too far away. The most he could have done would have been to attract the attention of one of Blücher's corps. Blücher had 3 corps marching towards Waterloo. One of them, 4th Corps, is the one that gets to the battlefield initially. The second one, 1st Corps, is the one that hits the French further north at the climax of the battle and breaks through there. The 3rd Corps is 2nd Corps, and that spends the day tramping along in the wake of 1st Corps, never actually gets to the battlefield. Had Grouchy appeared, Blücher could simply have turned that force aside and could have contained Grouchy, who simply didn't have enough troops to do the job. So in all sorts of ways then, the narrative of Waterloo is a manufactured narrative. It's a narrative which both sides have, if you like, collaborated in manufacturing. The British, because they want to hide the fact that Wellington got it wrong and put most of his troops in the wrong place. And the French, because, of course, they want to show that everything that Napoleon did was clever. Napoleon never made mistakes, and it was always somebody else's fault. So there you all go. I hope that hasn't been the worst sort of boring military history. I hope it's given you some fresh ideas or new ideas. And I hope that if you are foolish enough to go and see the forthcoming blockbuster, Care of Mr. Scott, I hope that you will go to see it with eyes that are perhaps more questioning than might have been the case otherwise. Thank you all very much. Good on my head. And of course, I'll take any questions that you want.
Well, we've got quite a lot of...
We have that. Thank you very much. Thanks, Janet. Thank you very much, Charles. That's very thought-provoking, I have to say. We have already got quite a few questions. Peter kindly sent a map over that he thought people might be interested in. If people are struggling to get things in their heads as to whereabouts they are. So if that's okay with you, I'll just share the map for a moment, just so people can have some kind of context, if that makes sense, of the positions. So this was the one. I shared my emails as well, though. That wasn't.
No, you haven't.
No, that's okay. I did wonder for a moment.
You might have done, actually.
Can I just comment on that quickly?
Please do.
It's actually very, very clear and very, very helpful. Just a couple of points. First of all, you can clearly see how Wellington's forces are heavily weighted towards his right wing, the left-hand side of his line as you're looking at it. Yeah?
Yeah.
And second of all, if you see down at the bottom, you've got a nice rectangular blob marked as Lobo.
Yeah.
Well, Lobo is the general I referred to as Mouton, and equally Dallon is the general I referred to as Drouet. You don't call Marshal Ney the Duc d'Archingan, so why do you call General Mouton the Comte de Lobo? I've no idea why they do this. But anyhow, Lobo's troops are not there. And you can see there's a nice, neat blue arrow showing them marching to the rear. Marching over to the right to meet the Prussians. That is made up. Lobo and his men were actually off the bottom right-hand corner of the map as you're looking at it. And they march up. In fact, you can see the road. You can see the Bois de Paris on the very right-hand side of the map. Yeah. And you can see a road running past it to a little place called Frischemont. Yeah, that's a road that Sixth Corps arrived on the battlefield on. And the general idea is that they're going to sweep past Frischemont and smash into Wellington's left wing. And the Prussians come pouring out of the Bois de Paris, taken completely by surprise. And the fight that I told you about when Mouton and his men sort of make this incredible stand, and they are the real heroes of Waterloo from the French point of view. They're actually arrayed on the road that you can see there, and they fall back between the two woods, just where the point of the arrow is. Yeah, do you see two woods there? And they form a line across that gap. And basically they're standing astraddle this long ridge which runs back towards Constois. So yeah, that's quite a useful map of the battlefield. Oh, incidentally, yeah, Ziethen's corps, first corps, that doesn't, well, it does start up there, but you see where the point of the arrow is. Oh, yeah, it actually veers to its left there, and you see there's a road coming down towards Frischemont. It marches down there and hits the French line, which is now sort of doubled back because the Prussians are pushing this way, sort of pushing down toward Constois, and it hits them just near Frischemont and advances diagonally towards La Belle Alliance, which is down here at the bottom. And of course, everything falls apart. So there you go. Yes, a useful map. I do apologise I didn't provide a PowerPoint. I find it very, very difficult to use a PowerPoint when I'm giving a talk online, if you see what I mean. I can do it perfectly well when I'm standing by a screen and I can say, look at this, look at that, look at the other. I really haven't worked out a way of doing it neatly. Anyway, that's me. You know, you can't, as I said to Ian, I think in an email earlier, you can't get the staff. Yes, I know. Yes. Anyway, question.
Thank you very much for the map, Peter. Much appreciated. Right, I'm going to stop the recording, and if Janet, if you want to go through the questions, that would be absolutely great.
Thank you.
There we go.